We are continuing now with our Meet the Candidate series for the 1st District Congressional race. That primary is less than 2 weeks away at this point on September 5th. Early voting is now well underway in that race. Our guest today is this man, Gabe. Gabe most recently worked in the White House with President Biden as a senior aide, as well as prior service with Governor Raimondo at the State House. He's from Pawtucket and is a first-time candidate. He is running as a Democrat in that crowded CD1 special election primary. Gabe, thank you so much for joining us as a part of our Meet the Candidate series today. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thanks for having me, John. I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts with the Rhode Island voters.
Now, I would guess you have a little extra bounce in your step today with those poll numbers that were released from your campaign. And before you respond to that, I just want to let our viewers know what we're talking about. Again, these are poll numbers from the AMO campaign that came out today. Aaron Regenberg, 28%, Gabe 19%. Sabina Matos, Sandra Cano tied at 11%, and Don Carlson in the upper single digits. Now, those are fantastic numbers for a guy who, when you got into this race, you were the mayor of Nowhereville, and you have gone from Nowhereville to second in the race. How did that surge happen?
Well, I started at 0%, but what I did is what voters expect, is having conversations in every setting, at the doors, at events, on the phones, and certainly telling my story. My story is a Rhode Island story. I grew up in Pawtucket, and because of the deep commitment that people have made in this community to me, I've had an opportunity to serve for 2 presidents of the United States and for Governor Raimondo here in Rhode Island.
Now, as you look at Aaron Regenberg, and he's, according to your poll, in the lead with 28%. So at this point, it looks like a 2-horse race. I want to ask you, unless there's a catastrophe on somebody's part, but at this point, it's a 2-horse race. What do you make of Aaron Regenberg, the candidate? Because the criticism of him is pretty extensive. I mean, he's been called a phony who's a spoiled rich kid who only cares about Joe and Mary Blue Jean because it helps him further his political ambitions. He's been called a hypocrite because he has for years badmouthed super PACs, but now his father-in-law starts a super PAC to help his campaign. And he's also been called a liar at that Roger Williams University, Boston Globe debate you were at last week. Sabina Matos asked him if he ever had any red boxes on his campaign. He said no, and then since then hasn't really give what I would say a definitive answer about that. Where do you stand in all of that, and what have you make of Aaron Regenberg as a candidate?
Well, look, I don't want to take pot shots at him personally, but I would say...
So you're giving him a pass?
I'm not giving him a pass.
Not personally, as a candidate.
Well, and that's where I'd pivot. I would focus, in fact, on our different approaches to how government should work and how it should play a role in people's lives. I take it, for example, the debt ceiling conversation. You might remember that President Biden was negotiating with House Republicans who were holding the country hostage on the debt limit, which could have been catastrophic. And instead, Aaron suggested that if he were in Congress, he would vote against that deal, which would have hurt Rhode Island seniors and veterans, in opposition to what Senator Reid, Senator Whitehouse, and certainly David Cicilline would have voted for. And they all voted for it. He said he'd vote against.
Well, Gabe, I would suggest that in this race, as far as the top candidates anyway, you're all pretty much in agreement. I know there are nuances here and there, but essentially you're all in agreement. So it gets down to the candidates and how people view the candidates. Do they trust them? Is there credibility? Can they handle themselves when there's adversity in the race? That's why I ask you, how has Aaron handled this adversity and the inevitable bumps in the road that come with every campaign?
Yeah, look, I would say I'm very focused on my own campaign. And the adversity that I faced, you identified. I started as someone that no one has voted for before and someone who had started with 0% name recognition. And I have communicated my message, shared my values, and I think that's resonating with Rhode Islanders.
Now, I have heard you repeatedly talk about your time working at the highest levels of government. Mm-hmm. I have yet to hear you talk, or very rarely talk, about your work as a lobbyist for Home Depot. Yeah. The Matos campaign clearly wants to remind voters of that service of yours. When you were a lobbyist for Home Depot, were you aware of how they were spending their political action money and the candidates they were giving to, specifically state legislators, who were very active in anti-LGBTQ plus policies?
Yeah, what I would say is my role was to focus on my mission of supporting work against organized retail crime with people like the Attorney General of Massachusetts.
Yes, but were you aware of how they were allocating their money?
Yeah, it's not something that I was responsible for.
So you were aware?
I was at the Home Depot for 6 months in 2019 before the election of 2020.
Okay, so I'm going to assume that you were aware of how they were using
Yeah,
their money.
I wouldn't say
So-
that's a fair assumption. What I would
Well-
say is that's not something that I was directly associated with.
Well, as a guy who worked at the highest levels of politics, you know how the sausage is made. So you know the impact that corporations have on policy and certainly on campaigns. I would find it hard to believe that you wouldn't look into and make a point to see how they would use their money.
Yeah, I would say that those weren't decisions that were under my purview.
No, I understand
And-
that, but
and-
do you decide to work for them? And for people in the LGBTQ plus community who hear that and are repulsed, what would you say to them? How do you square that with them as what kind of advocate you'd be for them?
Yeah, I would say people have heard me. I think that we need to stand very vigorously with the LGBT community in every capacity that's available, and that's what I would do as a congressman, John. That's what I would be focused on in Washington, and that is what I'm saying along the campaign trail.
Knowing what you know today, let's say you're unemployed on September 6th, would you take a job as a lobbyist for Home Depot?
Yeah, I don't know, John. It was an opportunity that I had. I wanted to get back to public service, so I left that and got back to working on campaigns and back in government, and that is where I am today.
All right, we'll end it there. Gabe Amo, thank you so much for your time. Good luck on the
Thank
campaign.
you so much, John.
All right.